So you talk about urbanism, a name that often comes up is Jane Jacobs. Urbanism isn't a canonical discipline that's taught in the great universities and colleges. And in many ways, it's just kind of a cobbled together discipline that is really at the intersection of a bunch of different disciplines. Architecture, civics, sociology, probably many others. What is great about urbanism is that, our great urbanists are not degree holders in urbanism. They are practical anthropologists who live in cities. And that's what I think of when I think of Jane Jacobs. She wrote this wonderful book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And it was really just her observations of her neighborhood, which is down here in Greenwich Village. And she talked about how the built environment and the uses to which it's put and the manner in which it's regulated has such a tremendous impact. It's sort of invisible to us because we take it for granted. We're navigating our way throughout the city in traffic, but the choices that were made and how to lay out and regulate our public realm, which is primarily here in New York City, our streets, has such a tremendous impact on how we experience the city. It's kind of amazing that the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which really was the blueprint for the Manhattan street grid, or most of it, is that old. It's almost 200 years old now, and yet, in fact, it's more than 200 years old now. Sorry for my math. And it stood up so well. I mean, and it's mainly just rectilinear, right? But somehow the proportions of the streets and of the sidewalks, except to the extent that they've been nibbled away since their original layout by the motor vehicle lobby, somehow the layout of the streets, the buildings, the alleyways, the sidewalks, it all works together. And I don't think you can have an appreciation of the best way to do that unless you have worn out a lot of shoe leather walking around a neighborhood like this, and honestly, until you've lived in it, had to go shopping to buy your milk or whatever else you buy in the neighborhood. And that's the great tradition of urbanism that Jane Jacobs came from. And in addition to writing this wonderful book, she is, I think, quite justly lionized by our movement here in New York City for livable streets, because she, again, not because she was a professional organizer, but she led a movement that just, deep-sixed a plan by Robert Moses to build a giant interstate elevated highway running through Washington Square Park, right down and to the right over there. And if you could just imagine like the BQE, an enormous elevated highway, and the way it just feels like a traffic sewer. Can you imagine running a highway like that through the arch in Washington Square? And yet that's exactly what was being proposed, and it was going to be done until they shut it down. So really, our urbanist heroes are not necessarily scholars or credentialed in that area or professionals, but they're people who have lived in a neighborhood and experienced it so fully that it's part of them. And when something threatens it, they know what to do. And they're the most effective advocates for an improved and human scale and human-centered public realm that there can be. So thank you, Jane, and all the others in your great tradition. I feel like I follow it. I just love talking about my neighborhood and doing everything I can to try to make it better. It's funny how on social media, when I talk about improvements that could be made in the public realm and in the management of the streets, people say, what you need to do is to move out to the country, move to Arizona, move to, wherever. I'm never going to leave here. I love New York City, and one of my favorite hobbies, and I think the hobby of any real New Yorker, is trying to think about how to make it better. That's what we learned from Jane Jacobs.